So, what kind of advice would a 65-year-old software developer have for people who are involved in either software development or data modeling or data analytics?
I built bots before they were cool.
I'd like to dedicate this video to the wonderful computer science students I met a couple months ago at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where I was invited to speak about competitive intelligence and then later that evening sit on a panel and discuss artificial intelligence. So I guess the first thing I'd want to say is that, there's so much rage baiting going on by people who are both for artificial intelligence and against artificial intelligence that I think I can understand why we would all feel gaslit at this point. And the reality is, if you do the math on a lot of these statements that people are making, the math just doesn't math. The physics doesn't physics. The probability of things like, orbiting data centers and whatnot are like I said, the math just doesn't math. People have different roles. If you are a CEO, your job is to raise capital, and that's what you do. If your role is one of somebody whose job is threatened by AI, you have a different perspective. The biggest thing I could tell those of us who are involved in this industry is that be realistic. That is the most important thing. Be realistic. And by that I mean this AI thing is not going away. And not only is it not going away, but it's not going to get regulated. And here's why. Even the most anti-artificial intelligence people would still like to see it used to cure diseases and such. And there's no government on this planet that is willing to give up artificial intelligence. So the reality is that it's here. Well,
maybe we can regulate it and just keep the good parts.
That probably won't happen either. There was a recent attempt at that in California where a bill had passed their legislature that there were basically just a couple of clauses to this bill. One of them would be that there had to be a master kill switch in whatever you're doing. And of course, when I read that and I realized how many single points of failure there are, I thought that was a little silly. But yeah, there should be a master kill switch. Why not? The other thing that they required was that the people who build these systems are responsible for them, which to me seems perfectly reasonable as well. And then the third thing is that the state was actually going to build a public lab for people to play with AI and different models and whatnot. And they were going to fund this for students and for startups and whoever wanted to use it. Well, it came to the governor's desk and it got vetoed, and the reason it got vetoed is not that it was a bad bill, but nobody else was doing it. And by enforcing it in California, you would basically be driving a lot of businesses off to, Texas, Utah, Nevada, who knows. And as much sense as that bill made, he was probably right to veto it because governments don't have jurisdictions large enough to regulate anything on a global basis. And I know people just think about the few companies here in the United States that are doing this kind of stuff, but France has a big program that's pretty serious. There are at least 3 programs in China that are all very serious. So if you regulate it here in the United States, you're not regulating it in Europe, you're not regulating it in Asia, and since all these companies are multinational, I don't know what you've really accomplished. Now, having said that, and having been around long enough to kind of watch the industry develop, it kind of feels like this is a succession of things that have been happening. Like when I first started, the first programming I did was actual machine language. From machine language, I went up to assembler. From assembler, I went up to a higher level language. From a high level language, we started getting into things like threaded languages, object-oriented languages, fuzzy logic, expert systems. And now today, the non-deterministic stuff that you find in large language and diffusion models. Being someone who's had to retrain probably every 5 to 7 years of my life, change kind of feels like progress. But I realize to a lot of people who are in industries that are very traditional and haven't changed for generations, this is really difficult stuff. I have found AI to be extraordinarily useful, particularly in areas that are not my expertise. For example, probably the biggest boom AI has been to me is in writing SQL queries. I mean, I've been writing these things for probably 20 years, but I obviously didn't read the spec as well as AI did, because it's come up with techniques and things that I would have never thought of. And my queries are really fast now. It'll even help you with indexing if you want. But that's an example. It's a way to augment what you're doing. If you see AI as a replacement for effort, I think you're going to be in for a real shock, because if you're just using AI to create functions or you're vibe coding, you realize that anybody can do that, right? And if you're not using your expertise, you're really not adding a lot of value. If you want to be a software developer who remains pure and writes Python code by hand, my advice is that you should probably be self-employed and have a really profitable idea, because you're going to be competing against everybody else who is using AI to A, supplement what they know, and B, scale their abilities. And by scale, I'm saying you really need to work at a higher level than coding. You're a software developer, you're not a coder. Software developer includes architecture, it includes application programming, it includes human interface, backups, where's security? I mean, there's a lot of things involved in software development that are not coding. That's where you need to be. You need to scale yourself a little bit more. You know, I find it really interesting. The story of Salesforce. A couple months ago, they very famously laid off a whole bunch of programmers, saying that they didn't need them anymore because they had AI. Now I see a lot of businesses that are using agentic artificial intelligence to do a lot of the things that Salesforce was doing. And they're saying, hey, with AI, we don't even need Salesforce anymore. And that's a big point, because this technology isn't like previous revolutions. For example, if you wanted to contribute in the Industrial Revolution, you would have needed a pile of capital, or you would have been a line worker someplace. Here, if you have a Chromebook and a library, I mean, you've got full access to all these models, and you can work at a really high level. Artificial intelligence is really democratizing that way, and it will always be that way because this stuff is in the public domain now. So to that extent, I see artificial intelligence to the software developer being a much bigger advantage than it is to the organization that you work for, probably. So how does this actually affect us as developers? I've read a lot of studies, a lot of rage baiting going on. I think the effects of AI are both over and understated. There was one study that talked about how AI affects developers' lifestyle. And what they found is that developers were a certain percentage more productive, but they were also working a certain percent less. To me, that sounds really healthy. And if that's what artificial intelligence can do for programmers, it might just be a good thing.